Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Johns Hopkins School of Education Master of Science in Education Policy virtual webinar. My name is Sion John. I'm the Assistant Director of Admissions here at the Johns Hopkins School of Education. Also presenting today, we have Professor and Faculty Lead of the Master of Science in Education Policy program, Dr. Dennis Kramer, joining us today. And before we get started, I would like to cover a few housekeeping topics. First, today's webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share a link with you after the event is complete. Please take a second to see if your mic is on mute and video is off right now. Please have your mic on mute and video off at all times during the presentation. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. I would like to share the agenda for today's virtual webinar. We will kick off the presentation sharing an overview of the Johns Hopkins School of Education. Then Dr. Kramer will go over the details of the Education Policy program. And lastly, I'll wrap it up with admissions requirements and leave the floor open for questions at the end. And to start, so we're one of 9 schools at Johns Hopkins University. We began offering college courses for teachers in 1909 and then became our own school in 2007. We are proud to share that the Johns Hopkins School of Education is consistently ranked one of the top schools in education by the U.S. News and World Report. And for school enrollment, we have approximately 1,741 students and offer 25 graduate programs, which includes doctoral, master's, and graduate certificate programs. And we do also have a strong network of over 24,000 SOE alums. And for faculty introduction, Dr. Dennis Kramer is a visiting associate professor and the faculty lead for the Education Policy program here at the Johns Hopkins School of Education. Dr. Kramer's research focuses on using behavioral insights to understand education-based decision-making, the antecedents and outcomes of federal, state, and local policy, and broadly the economics of education. His work has been featured in several top peer-reviewed journals within higher education, education policy, and public administration. Before his current roles, Dr. Kramer served on the faculty at the University of Florida and was the founding director of the UF Education Policy Research Center. And at this time, I would like to hand the floor over to Dr. Kramer.
Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I know you all have busy schedules, and so I really appreciate you joining us this afternoon to learn more about the education policy program at Johns Hopkins. Really excited about this program. I'm really excited about your interest and looking forward to the questions and answers, but want to start with sort of talking about why we created this program at Johns Hopkins. What we know over the past, decade, 2 decades, is that there's been a fundamental shift in the education policy landscape. We have shifted to this sort of accountability, performance, innovation-based environment that you can sort of tie back to the passage of No Child Left Behind. I'll sort of stop and say like I'm a policy wonk, and so if I get too deep in like the policy impacts, please tell me to stop in the chat. But what this sort of fundamental shift did is it really sort of increased the need for policy entrepreneurs or individuals who think critically about education policy at our state education agencies and in our local school districts. What it also did indirectly is increase sort of the need for critical policy scholars in the post-secondary avenue as well. Across the entire education spectrum, we have seen sort of this increasing trade-off, right, between increasing autonomy for increasing accountability. And this sort of increase in accountability comes with, this increase in autonomy comes with this opportunity to innovate, develop individualized policies that are sort of target need at your local or state level, and that the implementation of these policies have huge impacts on the outcomes we have for students across all sectors, right? Early childhood, K-12 education, all the way through post-secondary education. What we do know, and this is where I think why we sort of identified, at Johns Hopkins, a sort of need to develop what I think is one of the more unique education policy programs in the country. We do know that while there's a number of individuals who have sort of advanced training and experiences engaging with education policy, we sort of have identified that there's sort of a need to increase the capacity within these educational sectors and agencies for individuals who critically understand the policy development process, how to evaluate policy, and how to innovate and iterate policy changes that could have large-scale impacts on student achievement and institutional efficiencies, right? And so we sort of think about these policies in a broad set of categories, but we talk about sort of this emergence of new education policy accountability structures, right? We know that there's sort of pervasive narratives around the teacher pipeline. So how do we think about sort of innovating on the teacher preparation programs or teacher retention policies? How do we think about the sort of changing landscape of schools, right? The introduction of charter schools, the competition that comes with that, and how does that sort of impact our fiscal models, right? All of these are pressing questions that we see at all levels of education. And so we want to sort of think about, or we thought about those in designing a curriculum to engage students in each one of these content areas, but with a critical sort of policy development and policy evaluation lens. We also sort of have thought about, while there is sort of a need for additional capacity at the local school district, state level, and sort of post-secondary system level, there's also sort of a growing need for individuals to push the conversation forward and to fill gaps in these sort of national think tanks and nonprofit organizations. We know that these organizations play a critical role in sort of pushing large-scale reform agenda, particularly at the federal level. And how do we then supply those organizations with a set of potential new employees or a set of individuals that they can tap into that not only have critical education policy understandings, but have a distinct set of skills that allow them to come into these positions and really enact education policy change. So we can go to the next slide, please. So again, our program centers on the fact that we want to provide comprehensive, research-based, real-world, and work environment skills to those who are interested in pushing education policy conversations forward. I will say that predominantly our program focuses on K-12 education policy, but we have a growing number of individuals who are interested in post-secondary education, like myself. So my background is in post-secondary education. The program is between 33 and 36 credits. We'll get to that in a second. It's completely online, right? So the program, all of our classes are offered online. They're a mix of sort of completely asynchronous or sort of semi-asynchronous, as I call it, where they have primarily instruction happens asynchronously, but there are sort of synchronous or live opportunities to chat with faculty and your faculty and students. For example, I'm teaching the intermediate statistics course this semester, and I hold sort of like stat hour on Thursdays. The TA holds stat hour on Mondays, and we interact with students and work through sort of problems in that setting while they sort of engage with the lecture-based content at their sort of leisure, right? We know that the vast majority of our sort of enrolled students are full-time professionals, and we build our program around that flexibility to account for the time demands that come with being a full-time professional or working in sort of the field. And so our sort of instructional model is flexible in that regard. One of the things I think is incredibly unique is that part of the coursework does include a 1-week DC-based seminar. Now, for the last 2 years, that seminar has been virtual. we are sort of talking about, and we are talking about re-engaging that seminar as a DC based sort of residency. I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a future slide about who comes to these, but this is sort of an opportunity to, engage with your cohort and engage with education policy leaders to talk about sort of pressing items. Most of our students finish within 1 or 2 years. If you go full-time, it's a 1-year program. If you go part-time, it's a 2-year program. And we'll sort of talk about what that means. But I think what really sets our program apart is that all of our faculty who teach in this program come with significant backgrounds in education or public policy. On some level, each one of our faculty have held high-ranking positions in either a local, state, or federal education agency. I myself served as the director of policy research, the Policy Research and Analysis Group for the U.S. Department of Education, and prior served at the Office of Evaluation Sciences, which worked across the federal government to use behavioral insights to increase sort of take-up of programs. I also worked at the Georgia Department of Education as their senior policy analyst, right? So working on K-12 issues. So my background is very similar to the background you'll see across our program, where we have policy faculty members who, even if they're full-time faculty members, still create meaningful partnerships with local, state, and federal agencies to get their policy work out. And so what we try to do is bring these real-world examples into our classroom. So I taught the Intro to Education Policy seminar this summer, and part of that class was actually, addressing current issues that the Department of Education was facing, right? Around teacher pipeline, around student loan debt relief, other sort of aspects. So we bring these real world policy questions into our class conversations. And then, depending on sort of who your faculty is, those questions and your sort of work products could be delivered to high ranking education officials. And then those conversations can sort of develop organically. Next slide, please. So here's sort of a breakdown of our course sequence. I'm sorry, I screwed up the formatting, so I made some changes. But you can see here that we offer sort of a variety of classes over sort of beginning in your first summer, where you would sort of engage with, this is if you're going full time, you would take an introduction to statistics class. We can talk about sort of what that if required means. And then your intro to ed policy class. Right, this is a class that is in conjunction with the DC-based seminar. In the fall, you would take federal education policy, diversity, and intermediate statistics. In the spring, and each one of these I think are sort of complementary to the broad conversations that are sort of happening. In the spring, we have state and local education policy, international education policy, and education finance. And then in sort of the second summer or the final sort of semester, if you're going full time, we have outside the schoolhouse door, talking about sort of environmental factors and sort of non-education factors impacting sort of the school and the school environment, understanding education research, and a capstone project. We also offer an optional experiential learning, right, where our faculty and myself will sort of work with you to identify internships for you in leading think tank organizations, agencies in your local area, other sort of research organizations, depending on sort of what you want to do after graduation. And I can tell you that of the students that were engaged in this experiential learning, I think all now received a job offer from their internship placement. So if they were in an internship program, they receive sort of a job offer from that internship placement, right? So we try to sort of create meaningful connections in that experiential learning opportunity. What I think is unique about this sequence that you may not see in other education policy programs is the sort of 3 research courses that you would complete as part of the sequence, right? Introduction to statistics, intermediate statistics, and understanding education research, right? One of the primary goals of our program is to ensure that not only are you a critical consumer of education research, but that you also can be sort of a contributor to the education research process. So as part of this, we want to ensure that you have sort of the systematic training to engage in research, to identify research that is credible, and to use that credible evidence in your sort of education policymaking positions after graduation. I will say that this is sort of the full-time course sequence. You can take this in sort of a part-time sequence where you can take 1 or 2 classes, and we can talk about sort of what that looks like offline individually if you think you can only go part-time. But I will know that like these classes are sort of offered, once a year. So, if you want to take federal education policy in the fall, diversity won't be offered to the following fall, right? So like there is some sort of intentional sequencing that we have with these courses. And so if you want to go part-time, we have sort of 2 different part-time tracks based on sort of your interest. Next slide, please. So as I sort of alluded to, we sort of formalize here directly for you in the PowerPoint, what we want to do as a core sort of outcome of our program at Johns Hopkins is to prepare graduates to analyze and evaluate education research, right? First and foremost, understand and determine the sort of validity of the research that is being presented to you. Second, we want to learn, we want you to gain experience and knowledge base in order to translate that research into policies that ultimately create meaningful change at whatever level or whatever organization that you're working on education policy for. You can sort of see like, this is sort of the expectations I hold my program faculty to in each one of the classes, right? We expect that each class will contribute to your ability to analyze and evaluate research, that it talks about the sort of heterogeneity or the differences in structures in public education across both local environments, but also internationally, that you can utilize and where to go and know where to access data to make these sort of comparisons, that you have variety of examples on how to translate research into policy recommendations and how to write for broad audiences, right? So it's one thing to write for academics. It's another thing to write for sort of a congressional inquiry. It is completely different to write for sort of the 3rd grade teacher. And so because, as part of sort of some of these classes, we're going to expose you to legislative and regulatory language. As somebody that worked in the federal government, regulatory language is incredibly important to bound how policies can be implemented. And so understanding regulations and statutes helps us think through what are the constraints around policy implementation and how can you be a critical sort of policy entrepreneur that makes recommendations understanding those constraints. Of course, we need to sort of look at budgets as the faculty of the education finance class. And as an economist, like I think that is an incredibly important skill. We're going to sort of not only sort of provide opportunities to learn about the technical aspects of funding education, but also sort of thinking through policies and how policy changes can, even minor policy changes, can significantly change the structure in which we think about financing models. And then I think, we want to sort of think about how these policies, right? What are their broad impacts? But more importantly, what are the sort of the unintended impacts or the sort of more micro impacts on particularly populations who are underserved or marginalized, right? We know that we oftentimes make policy in the aggregate and policy as sort of an average effect. We want to be critical policy consumers and policy entrepreneurs that think about what are the unintended impacts of these policies, right? What does it mean for sort of these less informed educational participant or these educational or these groups that have sort of lower educational capital? And then clearly across all of our classes, we try to tie assignments to real world activities, right? This is not just sort of a program that rests on writing a bunch of research papers. We want you to gain a variety of sort of written skills, right? Longer reports, policy memos, op-eds, policy briefings, right? We want to expose you to a variety of writings and give you opportunities to get those products in front of decision makers. For example, in the Intro to Policy class, we were taking up an issue on charter schools, and I actually took one of the memos from the students and took it over to the Secretary of Education and said, hey, give us a read. I think there's some really good ideas here, right? We want to expose you to a broad set of policymakers and give you the tools to talk with a broad set of policymakers. We also want to make sure that when you leave this program, you have a set of work products that you can take out with you in the job market, and in an interview or in another setting. You can say, hey, I have this degree, I can consume and critically analyze research, I have a sort of policy sort of knowledge, and here's some examples of my ability to communicate that policy in an effective way. Next slide, please. So I think one of the most exciting parts, and I think the students would also tell you this, is the residency that we hold in your first summer in the program. Usually the last week of July or first week in August. And it's in conjunction with your Intro to Ed Policy course. It's a week long, it's supplementary to coursework. And we try to immerse you into the world of education policy through guest lectures. Last year we did it virtually, but we had former Secretary of Education and current president of the Ed Trust, Dr. John King, show up and talk. We had the chancellor of the former chancellor now of the community college system in California, Ela Oakley, show up. We had a number of other sort of high-ranking individuals in the education policy space come and just talk to students, right? This is just for the education policy program. It's a very sort of intimate setting where they're presenting, given their sort of history and talking about a topic that they want to impart knowledge on you. And then there's a sort of an intimate question and answer period. And so we spent a good 30 minutes just having a back and forth with John King about his experiences as Secretary of Education, as the commissioner in New York, and what he sees as a sort of next step in the education policy space for leaders, right? So our goal is to sort of bring these 8 to 10 speakers to you during this week-long residency. This week-long residency also serves as sort of a cohort building activity, right? Our goal when it's in person is to supplement our lectures with other activities, right? Going down to DC and going to Capitol Hill and talking with legislators, or sitting in a committee meeting, taking a tour, engaging in the DC education policy process, going having lunch with researchers at a think tank, picking their brain about what it means to develop education policy research. This week-long residency is meant to sort of expose you to a variety and a wide range of education policy professionals. Next slide, please. So I've already talked about this, but I think, I believe fundamentally in this program. I believe this program prepares students for, the cutting edge education policy jobs. And the reason it is we built this program. Dr. David Steiner was the sort of architect of this program, and then I am honored to sort of take this on after he sort of stepped away. But this program was built very much to fill the needs that we saw, Dr. Steiner and I, in our own hiring at the federal and state level. And so we really feature sort of high level, real world experience faculty. And that is, and I think that's unique, right? It's not just sort of abstract questions that are being asked in class. These are sort of questions that all the faculty wrestled with either at one point in time about critical policy issues. And we think sort of this program's coursework and the research training is a critical piece, are grounded in this sort of idea of how do we become reform agents? How do we become policy reform agents to go into, these positions after graduation to really make a meaningful difference in sort of district, state, or federal education departments? And if you don't want to be in sort of a government sort of bureaucracy, right? How do we then prepare you to go into these research-based organizations or nonprofit organizations? Next slide. So I think this is something I'm really excited about. This is something that I started when I was lucky to take over this program. Is we also offer this fellows program. So as part of this program, you can apply as part of the application process to become part of the Education Policy Fellows program. It does come with additional sort of financial aid, an additional stipend to sort of support or defray the cost of your program. But really what it also does is these EPFs become sort of the ambassadors to the program, right? There's a smaller set of students. They play a leadership role in sort of helping us gather speakers. We try to host at least a speaker every month that's in an education policy position. The sort of EPFs are the ones that sort of come up with a list of speakers that they think would be interesting, and I sort of help facilitate those conversations. They're the ones that, like, if we want to get a small group together, that they are going to be sort of our ambassadors, and they work on a coordinated policy report that we sort of tackle for either a state, federal, or local education agency. And so we sort of reach out to these agencies and say, hey, what sort of a large report you want done? These like EPFs are the ones that sort of work on that report as part of their fellowship. This is part of your application if you choose to apply to this program. There's a short set of additional questions that you would answer. It is open to everyone in the School of Education, but last year we only awarded these to those that were in our education policy program. So the education policy master's students get the sort of first crack at this fellowship program, and if there's extra sort of available funds and spaces, then we open it up to students across the School of Education. I think the next slide is back to you, Sion.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kramer, for the wonderful presentation. So now we're going to continue by going over the application requirements. First, you'll need a 3.0 or better cumulative undergraduate grade point average. Applicants must also submit a completed application, which can be found on the school's website. The application fee is $80. Official transcripts from all post-secondary institutions attended. We need all official transcripts, including institutions you may have taken courses but did not receive a degree. Essay and a current resume, 3 letters of recommendation, and finally, the GRE is not required for this program. And please note that we are currently accepting applications for the Education Policy Program, and the application deadline date is April 17, 2023. There are a few additional steps you need to take in order to complete the application process if you're an international student. You must submit a TOEFL or IELTS score, and if your degree was completed outside of the U.S., you will need to complete a course-by-course evaluation. Additional information can be found on the school's website. The tuition for the 2022-2023 academic school year for the MS in Education Policy program is $1,365 per credit. In addition to the tuition, please keep in mind the registration fee is $175 per semester, and the application fee is $80. For additional information on tuition and fees, please visit the SOE website. And if you're interested in applying for financial aid, we strongly encourage you to apply for financial aid when you start your application. In addition to the Fellows Program that was shared by Dr. Kramer, the School of Education offers a limited number of partial need-based institutional scholarships each year. SOE's endowed scholarship awards range on average from $500 to $1,500 per semester and are applied to tuition expenses beginning in the fall semester. To see if you qualify to apply for the endowed scholarship, please visit the Grants and Scholarship page on the school's website. Thank you for attending the Education Policy virtual webinar. At this time, we would like to open up the floor for questions. All right, so Dr. Kramer, while we wait for questions, we have a lot of questions that we get here in the Office of Admissions. And actually, that was the question I was going to ask that Isabel is asking. What backgrounds do students come from before starting this program?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think it's a variety of backgrounds. I think there is, individuals who have been in the classroom, right, who are teachers are looking to sort of transition to a policy role, or transition out of the classroom into a more sort of district or state level position. There are individuals that come straight from undergraduate who are, were in public policy or were in or who were in sort of other sort of undergraduate majors. There's individuals who are work on the Hill, who work in sort of policy organizations already, but want that sort of additional academic training. So it's not sort of a requirement explicitly or implicitly that you come from sort of an education background. In fact, I think coming from a variety of disciplines helps our conversation and helps us think through sort of like innovative policy options. And so hopefully that answered your question. Are most students based in the DMV area? I think that depends of cohort to cohort. I think our first cohort, only about 2 of the individuals were from what I would say broadly, the DC or Baltimore area. The second cohort, we had about 30%, 40% of the individuals from the DC area. Part of what we're trying to do is identify additional travel funds to support those that want to come for the residency or other sort of activities. But I think growing sort of our DMV perspective, like I think being in the DMV area sort of increases the sort of likelihood that you can sort of access these sort of like either like last minute opportunities, like the secretary's coming to Baltimore, wants to talk with our ed policy students, face to face. If you're in the DMV area, it's certainly easier. All of our activities, or I would say the vast majority of our sort of cohort-based activities will have sort of an online virtual component for those that want to engage with that. So even happy hours, we'll sort of set up this like virtual sort of setting. But okay, I see questions coming in fast and furious. I like it. Please keep.
Yes, there's a lot of questions. There's a
I
lot of
like
good
it.
questions. There's one from
What?
Maria too. I know in the beginning it says, do you have students from backgrounds that are not related with education?
Yep. Yeah, I think we talked about that a little bit earlier about there is, again, there's a variety of backgrounds that are sort of available, and that students come from. Again, I think, the nice thing about sort of education is that we've all have our sort of lived experiences with education. We bring that sort of with us into our policymaking process. And so, you will get foundational training in sort of the policy process, the education policy process. And so I think, if you want to come from a variety of backgrounds, that's perfectly fine. What this part-time track? So the part-time track, essentially you take 2 classes in the first year and 1 class a semester in your second year. Or you can flip that, 1 class in your first year and then 2 classes in your second year. And I think I think Amanda, your question is going to also sort of bleed into Maria's question, the room for electives in the curriculum. Yes, we are implementing some electives or some courses that can be substituted for electives. In particular, courses like international education is a course, or outside the schoolhouse is a course where you can sort of supplement or identify electives that sort of fit your interest, right? If you don't want to sort of focus on international education, but you want to focus on, let's say, higher education, you can take a class on sort of higher education policy or other electives that are available. And so that'll be something that we will implement. I will be sort of, my students will tell you that sometimes I'm too honest with how I present things. Implementing a new curriculum or a new piece of a curriculum, what this elective looks like, is going to be sort of our first attempt at it. And so you have to be sort of flexible with us as we sort of identify the electives, as we identify the courses that we think are appropriate for sort of a policy student to supplement our base curriculum. But there will be some classes that are just sort of fundamental core classes for our program. Jacqueline, great question. As somebody who has focused on higher education policy my entire life, there certainly is space for higher education policy to happen as part of this program. I do think we do focus a lot on K-12. Given the compulsory nature of K-12 education, right, it becomes a really interesting sort of policy landscape. As we sort of grow the higher education interest, we can certainly explore additional electives or alternatives that we can sort of come together and facilitate that that interest. Maria, your question about how many students are admitted.
Dr. Kramer, I could
Yep.
share that.
Good.
So
Thank
for
you.
the past 2 years, so for summer 2021, we have admitted 27 students. And then for summer 2022, we had a total admit of 37.
Great. And I think it's sort of, as the program grows, we get more and more applications.
Mhm.
What we as a faculty try to do is build a diverse cohort of diverse experiences, perspectives, backgrounds, so we really can facilitate, really interesting dialogues that can happen as part of our conversation. There was a question about sort of, I think it was sent to me directly, and so I apologize that you guys can't see this, but it was about sort of the asynchronous versus synchronous classes. And I can just talk about my experiences as a faculty member. So asynchronous, again, like we have lecture videos, readings, everything up on our Canvas learning management system. But then I run sort of my asynchronous touch points at 7 o'clock at night, right? This is sort of my way of trying to address individuals who are working professionals and individuals who are across different time zones. I recognize that that's 4 o'clock for those on the West Coast, which may be a little bit early for their sort of work. But for the vast majority of students in the program that resides outside of their typical work hours, I will say that every single one of those sessions are recorded. And you can see sort of the conversation that was happening. And I will also say that all of the faculty in this program are incredibly accessible. So if you can't make these like the synchronous sessions, you can reach out and you can have an individual conversation with them. Talk about sort of what either you're struggling with content, or you need additional sort of instruction, or you just want to have an applied policy conversation. I think that our faculty understand that this program, by and large, is enrolled by individuals who are working full-time, and we're flexible about the sort of pressures that come with working full-time. Sion, can you answer the question about rolling admissions?
So the question is, will the admission to the program be given in a rolling basis? So if you apply before the application deadline day, which is April 17, 2023, if you apply before then, you should be able to hear back in regards to your the final decision within like the 4 to 6 weeks. Is that fair, Dr. Kramer?
That's very fair.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, we do evaluate on a quasi rolling admissions basis. And I will say I'm also happy to sort of have conversations individually with those of you that are looking to apply. I know Pamela asked about sort of common pitfalls in the application to avoid. I think I'll just tell you my perspective as one of the individuals that reviews applications is I look for sort of that connection, right? That your story, your connection to education policy, right? What is sort of the contribution that you want to make to the landscape, right? None of us can fundamentally reform the entire education policy process, but what are sort of the individual education policy areas that you want? And how does your background, your experiences speak to that, right? How can you document or demonstrate to those reading your application that you have, one, the passion for the area in which you are sort of trying to make change, and two, sort of like where are the opportunities for you to grow to gain the skill sets for that? I think oftentimes in applications, we want to, and this is true for any graduate program, we want to sort of identify, or we want to portray ourselves as like the seasoned education policy individual when we apply. I am much more interested in finding or reading the applications that talk about sort of how the curriculum or how the program can help advance you to your ultimate goal, right? It is, in my perspective, perfectly fine to say, I've been working in education for X number of years, but I haven't had an opportunity to engage in real policy conversations, right? I've been sort of on the implementation side or the classroom side or, the operations side. I'm looking forward to this program to providing or facilitating that option to engage in policy conversations, right? So again, it's about getting your narrative across to the faculty who are reviewing your application and making the connection to the program's mission and curriculum. I'm seeing, though the focus on the program is on K-12 education, is of course applicable to pre-K policy as well. Yeah, so while it says K-12 in all of our classes, and I can speak for the 3 that I teach in this, the Intro to Ed policy class goes through the entire continuum of education policy from pre-K all the way through higher education. I know that Dr. Plucker's federal education policy also talks about pre-K and higher ed policy in addition to K-12 policy. The education finance will talk about sort of funding models and how they differ in early childhood versus post-secondary versus sort of our K-12 structure. So we try to give you a broad overview of sort of the education policy process while identifying the sort of commonalities across the sectors and the differences, right? Those differences are really important to sort of understanding why policy implementation or policy recommendations fail. There's a question about if you are sort of removed from undergraduate and recommendation letters. For me, like recommendation letters can come from anybody, right? They don't have to come from faculty, right? They can come from people you work with, principals, school leaders, community organizers, board members, right? Anybody that sort of can speak to your sort of, 1, your passion for education, 2, any prior policy experiences you have, and 3, sort of your ability to be sort of a critical consumer of knowledge. That's what we're looking for in these sort of education policy or in these letters of recommendation for our program. So I wouldn't be like overly concerned. I wouldn't be overly concerned about sort of the, who is writing the letters, more about what they're writing about the letters, right? Do you discuss school governance structures? 100% we discuss school governance structures, right? That's discussed in a variety of classes. One, it's hard to talk about funding without talking about governance models. In our outside the schoolhouse, there's talking about sort of how districts are sort of organized and how sort of the charter school movement has sort of changed governance models at the local level. So we do dive into those topics across a variety of classes. What is the percentage of international students in the past year? Sion, you might have a little more insight into the international student presence.
So I don't have the exact percentage for the education policy program, but at least overall in SOE, the past 2 years ago, it was about 14%. Last year, 24%. And Maria, if you are curious to know about the percentage of international students for the education policy program, definitely reach out to the Office of Admissions and we'll let you know.
Great. Yeah, there's a question about ed reform. Ed reform, I think, is a underlying sort of theme across nearly all of our courses. Ed reform, policy evaluation, issues of equity, those are sort of cross-cutting themes that across all of our a variety, most of our classes, if not all of our courses in this program. And so we'll continue to sort of go back to those issues as sort of interesting policy, one about the theory of education reform, but also as interesting sort of reform initiatives, right? And we use those reform initiatives as sort of demarcation points in the policy process and talk about sort of how the reform initiatives change, what we can learn from those implementations, right? NCLB fundamentally changed the way we think about education policy, but it wasn't perfect. So what can we learn from that? ESSA fundamentally changed the way we think about education policy, but it wasn't perfect. What did we learn from that, right? So different sort of reform initiatives that we sort of embed in those conversations. Jacqueline, great question. I am very biased in this question, in the sense that, like, I think this is a great program for somebody in higher education. Even though there may be a focus on K-12, I fundamentally believe that higher education policy scholars can't do research or can't make higher education policy decisions in a vacuum. We have to understand the 13 years or more, 14, 15 years of schooling and experiences that happened before somebody steps foot on a college campus in order to implement really effective policies, right? And I think, that's why I took a job at a K-12 state education, Department of Education in Georgia, was because I didn't have the K-12 experience. And I wanted that to break down the silos between K-12 and higher education, right? And that served me well at the Department of Education, because we do deal with, higher ed and K-12 issues. And I think as we sort of continue, as sort of the policy environment develops, I think we'll see much more integrated policies, right? We can think about sort of the teacher pipeline being an integrated policy issue, right? If we have a shortage of teachers, right, there are certainly K-12 policies that could sort of address that. But if we are not producing more new teachers, we're always going to have a sort of deficit, right? So that's a K-12 policy impacting, or excuse me, a higher education teacher preparation policy impacting the supply of teachers at the K-12 level. Great question about diversity, equity. 100%. We not only are we policy entrepreneurs, we want to be critical policy entrepreneurs as part of this program. And we have a number of I think leading experts in the field of critical education policy at Johns Hopkins on the faculty, right? And so we bring those faculty in through the diversity class specifically, but also as guest speakers and guest lecturers across a variety of our classes, right? It is really hard for us to be critical policy scholars without having those tough conversations, right? And I think that's one of the things about any education policy program that you might be considering, is that in order to really get systematic education policy training, you really have to engage in the sort of tough conversations, right? And acknowledge the biases that we bring to the policy-making process, right? And I talk about this at length in my intro to ed policy class, and that, like, education policy is one of the only areas in which everyone thinks that they are an expert in, right? If you go onto Capitol Hill, everybody went through the education process. By and large, most policymakers at the state and federal level have an advanced degree, and they felt like their education process was the way it should be for everybody, right? But there's a lot of biases there, right? And so then how do we sort of understand biases that people bring into the education process? How do we have those tough conversations? How do we tie policy recommendations that acknowledge the sort of lived experiences of the decision makers, but then also highlight the potential challenges that policy might mean for other sort of groups? And so really, Camille, I think it's a fundamental question to our program, is how do graduates of this program, how does the program arm our graduates to not only understand the policy process, but to then be a critical policy entrepreneur and implement policies that could address some of these structural barriers or systemic racism or systemic biases that exist within the educational process, right? I don't have the answer of how we do that in a snap of our fingers. I think this program takes a very critical approach to these conversations and has those tough conversations across cohorts, right? As part of my classes, and I can only speak for my classes, particularly when we talk about these, I put up a slide that says, we are going to talk about an issue that is going to engender real feelings, right? And everyone's feelings are going to be respected. If you can't have that respect in a dialogue, then like you can remove yourself from the conversation, because we have to have these critical conversations. We have to have these tough conversations in order to advance policies that address, barriers that have been in place for centuries. And I think that it goes back to my comment about incremental policy changes, right? We cannot implement a single policy to right the wrongs of systemic racism in education. We can implement policies that incrementally reduce that. And that's, I think, the policy approach I want the graduates of this program to take. Well, the program provides access, extra activities, webinars, conferences. Yes. So the Education Policy Fellows take the lead in identifying speakers to come to our program once a month, right? We want to expose you to as many policy professionals as we possibly can. And so that is one thing that's just for this program. The School of Education at Johns Hopkins, because of where it's located, has a number of people that come through the Baltimore area and talk to the school, right? You have access to those, community or school-wide events as well as a Johns Hopkins student. And then I think, there are a number of sort of things that take place in DC that if you're local, you can come attend in person, but if you're not local, we can facilitate sort of virtual access to those in order to supplement your sort of instruction as part of this program. I will also say that like some of this is I think on the students in our program reaching out to faculty or reaching out to me and saying, hey, I want this experience. I want this, specific sort of introduction, or I want to learn more about X. Right. And it's my job as a program lead is to find those opportunities for you. Right. If you want to learn about how to talk, about how to not lobby, but how to get your research in front of legislators. All right, let's try and find, let's try and facilitate a meeting. Right. One of our other cohort members is a congressional aide. Right. She does education policy for a member of Congress. So can we connect you with her? And can she give you some insights into like how she got involved in that process? And so a lot of this is sort of like reaching out to the faculty and allowing us to use our networks to build those sort of additional experiences that you would want to get as part of this program, right? This is Johns Hopkins, right? We have what I think is probably one of the best education faculties in the country. But the faculty that is truly committed to your sort of growth as a student. Does the online program structure allow for students to cross over and take other course offerings available at JHU? Yeah, so we are implementing 2 or 3 of our classes will be sort of elective eligible, where you can take other sort of classes. Now, I will say that like I can promise that my faculty in this program will be flexible to sort of individuals who are working full time. So asynchronous or classes that are offered sort of after the sort of work hours. I can't promise that for sort of other programs, right? So if you sort of go into an elective or you go into, another program for those class substitutions, right? There may be sort of other sort of scheduling demands that you have to balance. And so that's going to be part of the sort of, course review process, right? So as we sort of implement these new elective functions, finding the courses that are offered at night or that are offered asynchronously, I think are really important. All right. Would you say the overarching focus is on federal policy? No, I mean, I will. So like, as I said before, like acknowledging bias, like I have to acknowledge my biases, right? So like I am a federal policy practitioner. So like my experiences are primarily at the federal level or historically been at the federal level. I have some state level experiences, but in our classes, we talk about sort of policy making at every level, the local, the district, the state, and the federal level. I think because we're positioned in like the DC area, right, we have unique access to federal education policy scholars. And the networks of like my networks are predominantly federal education policy scholars. And so we do have a number of other faculty who have worked at the state level, or district level. They can provide access to those networks. And so I think, if you're sort of hearing a federal policy if it feels like it's slightly a federal policy dominant conversation, that's because that's the sort of biases that I bring from my personal experiences.
Okay, so it looks like there are no more questions. Move on to the next slide. On this slide, we have some important contact information. So for any admissions related questions, please reach out to the Office of Admissions. Here's the email address and the phone number. Any program related questions, please reach out to Miss Jennifer Fordham, and her email address is on this slide as well.
And I'll just sort of say that Jenny is like one of the most amazing people that I know. She will make sure your questions get answered quickly. I will also throw my email into the chat box in case anybody wants to reach out to me directly. I think it's on the website as well, but I'm also happy to answer questions that you have. But if you don't get a response from me, within 24 hours, you can also reach out to Jenny and she'll make sure that you get any information that you need.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kramer. Thank you, everyone, for your interest in the Johns Hopkins School of Education. We look forward to hearing from you. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.